Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I am your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to have Chris Ballinger, founder and CEO of MOBI, the Mobility Open Blockchain Initiative. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm super happy to have you here, and I want to say this, economics are cool, and you've done really cool things in economics, so I can't wait for this conversation. So, Chris, at the University of California, Berkeley, you studied international economics. What were some of your biggest takeaways studying international economics, and how did you apply those learnings to your career?
I'll mention two, one of which I think is right, and one of which maybe turned out to be wrong. One of them is marginalism, the idea that prices are determined on the margin, that it's the margin that matters. It's the marginal transaction that determines the cost, the opportunity cost, and things. And that's something that many people get through 5 years of graduate school in economics and never really internalize. But every trader, whether they're trading tomatoes or billion-dollar lots of currency or Bitcoin or GameStop on a Reddit forum, intuitively knows prices are determined on the margin. It's the last trade that matters. That's important. The other thing that I learned in international economics and monetary economics in particular is that private monies don't work. Money, it was tried in the Middle Ages. Every pope tried his private money. Every duke tried his private money, and it never ended well. The incentives are too strong to debase the currency. So that's something that gets drilled into you in your monetary economics course. And that's the one that maybe interestingly turned out to be wrong, because now we have the example of Bitcoin and various other digital currencies that seem to solve many of the problems of private money. Bitcoin in particular has taken over one aspect of money, which is store of value, and seems to be doing that pretty well through an algorithmic deflation monetary policy that's built in. So those are two things.
So you've learned all about the prices determined on the margin. You've got this really great education coming out of the University of California, Berkeley, and then you go into 28 years experience in the finance industry, having held senior positions at Bank of America, Toyota Financial Services, and the Toyota Research Institute. A lot changed during that time. What were some of the biggest changes during that time that you saw that impacted the businesses that you were leading as CFO?
Well, I'll go back even further than that. I think I've been through a lot of really fun and interesting revolutions, starting with the revolution in computing and the digitization of finance that led to bond math and discounting and derivatives and securitization. All of those I kind of lived through the Wild West days of on trading floors and got to experience some really fun times and interesting technology advancements in finance. But the biggest and the one that I think is most exciting and maybe will have the biggest impact is what we're seeing right now with digital currencies. Bitcoin is a $1 trillion asset now. We're close to it. Other digital currencies aren't too far behind. And central banks are coming out with digital currencies. There's an enormous variety of different types of things that are being tokenized and used in various functions of money. And I think we've seen an explosion of it in the last 10 years. I think the next 10 years are going to be where it gets really interesting. Can regulation slow down this movement towards digital currencies? Oh, sure. Regulation and it can change the path of it. It's not only, maybe you see it with things like Facebook Libra. Libra had a plan to introduce an alternate global currency, the Libra token. The day after they announced it, or literally minutes after they announced it, half of the world's monetary authorities gave press conferences saying not on their watch, and the next day the other half did. So it had almost universal opposition from government central banks. It's the thing that kind of united the Trumpists and the leftist Democrats. Opposition to Libra. It's hard to find anybody in government who was a supporter. Libra has since rebranded, but it's clear that it's a government policy and government opposition can change the path and plans of even a company, a consortium as large as Facebook Libra. And I think that the decisions that governments make about introducing central bank digital currencies will probably have a big impact in the space. And whether those are adopted versus various flavors of private digital currencies.
Was the global opposition to Libra driven by just because of the Facebook name, when they say, well, look what you're doing in elections, look at what you're doing in this? Did that kind of drive some of that opposition, since Facebook has been in the news for not a lot of good things lately?
I think some of that, the news that came out about the same time about the Cambridge Analytica, probably didn't help. But it wasn't just a perception. It wasn't just a mistrust of Facebook. I think there were some real substantive issues and problems with the way they had it proposed. Number one, it was linked to a basket of currencies, so it was not tied to any one fiat, which meant it was truly an independent monetary system, and therefore a competitor outside of the control of any government. That was a threat. I think that central bankers looked at the plans for how they would run their reserve and keep it stable, and saw really big systemic risks. The plan was to hold reserves in relatively safe sovereign and bank assets. Well, the problem is, if you're running a reserve and your revenue source is carry on that reserve, then there's a strong temptation to stretch a little bit I'll take a little bit more risk to increase the return. And that works out great in most environments. But as soon as you have a shock, then the additional risk and additional leverage that's been put in, right, can cause problems. If you have a breakdown or a sudden failure of trust in a global world currency that's outside of government control, then you have a real problem. And I think that's a legitimate concern, and one that the new consortium, now called Diem, is trying to address in a number of ways.
From your experience on trading floors, you've seen a lot of risk. You've probably seen booms and busts. And today, fintech startups are raising capital by the billions, capturing global headlines, stocks going up 200-300% a year. Is the market for fintech too hot?
Yeah, low rates and easy money lead to increased leverage and low risk premia. In the long run, that always ends badly. But in the short run, it means lots of millionaires. And it's really hard to tell whether you're, when the long run is arriving. And so in some sense, what you see, all the frothiness, is a rational response to low interest rates and low risk premia. If you're playing with other people's money, which low rates allow people to do, then you take more risk. That's a purely rational response. But from the perspective of the economy and the risk in the economy, that can lead to sharp corrections in time, always does. And the problem with predicting it is that it always seems to happen in an unexpected way, coming from an unexpected source that nobody saw it coming, in a way that inflicts the most pain on the maximum number of people who can't afford it.
That's a pattern throughout history, and it's a pattern that will only continue throughout history. We saw it with I think it was in the 1800s when the railways blew up in the UK. We saw it with the UK bicycle bubble, and then we saw it with the South Sea bubble. And there's so many of these different bubbles that implode. But another thing that's in the news a lot now is cryptocurrency, and especially Bitcoin. But there's a lot more to cryptocurrency than just Bitcoin. There's this whole blockchain, incredible technology being built behind that. And one of the things that you're working on is enabling blockchain technology for the mobility market. Could you talk about that a little, please?
Sure. Yeah. Bitcoin is really interesting because it proved that you could turn anything, even an idea, into a bearer instrument. And previously, sort of only cash was a bearer instrument, and that had all kinds of problems with its anonymity and money laundering and potential for abuse. But the underlying technology, the blockchain technology, means that not only you can create not only a digital money, but digital representations for art, for real estate, for royalties, for data, and even cars. And when blockchain is used to register the attributes of a physical thing, you can create a digital twin, and using the digital twin is much more efficient than having to deal with the physical object in the physical world. there's a couple of things that come out of applying blockchain in mobility. One is you can link the vehicle's digital twin, its digital representation, or it's a vehicle, a decentralized digital identifier for the vehicle, to location. Right? If you can link location and the vehicle's identity, the trusted identity, then you can create a trusted trip. If you can create a trusted trip, you can pay as you go for things. You can do micro-tolling. You can do road usage charging. You can do usage-based insurance. There's all kinds of things that now become possible. Second, when the physical thing that you're digitizing is a vehicle with sensors, 5G connections, AI, and a million lines of code, then you're enabling this physical thing to autonomously interact and transact with its environment. So it can become an economic agent. And that era of automatic transactions, of autonomous transactions, where vehicles are autonomous economic agents, will probably arrive sooner. And this is probably a pretty controversial thing to say on your podcast. But I think the transactions, these autonomous transactions, will probably arrive sooner and may, in the end, be more impactful than true autonomous driving, than level 5 autonomous driving that everybody's been promising for years.
It's not a controversial statement. It's an honest statement, because commerce is going to drive all of this. And if you can't monetize a trip, you're never going to make money. There's no way that I have seen any economist, any person in finance show me the model of how you're going to make money with dense urban robotaxis. What I've seen to make a lot of money, if you start doing in-vehicle commerce, and because you can expand the margins. And one of the things MOBI's working on is the digital VINs, or the digital vehicle identification. And there's this incredible gentleman that was part of a MOBI lecture series, Alan Gordon, who's the technical lead at Ford's Greenfield labs in Silicon Valley. And during that presentation, Mr. Gordon said the following: the problem with a VIN is that it's good for the physical world. It's not good for the digital world. Will you please kindly expand upon that statement, and will Mr. Gordon's premise allow you to conduct that digital commerce?
Yeah. So Alan is one of the earliest members of our community. He was involved in the very earliest meetings of a bunch of us out in Silicon Valley, from auto companies and tech companies before MOBI was formed, who'd been interested in doing sort of these proof of concepts in their companies, in their Silicon Valley labs. And one of the earliest ones that Ford did, that Alan was working on, was a digital ID for the car. And Alan later became, when MOBI was formed, he became one of the co-chairs of the VID working group, the Vehicle Identity Working Group. And that's going to have gone through 2 phases. The first co-chair with Alan was Renault, and the second version of it, second iteration of that working group, was with BMW. And they have now released one standard, and they're about to release a second standard on vehicle identity. But the reason it's so important, and the reason the VIN isn't good for the digital world, is that it's analog. It's not machine readable. It's not immutable. It has limited value as a trust anchor. What you need for the digital world is a secure identity for something. There's this great cartoon that you're probably familiar with, most of your listeners probably are, of 2 dogs in front of a computer. This cartoon is the most reproduced cartoon in the New Yorker's history. But the one dog is looking at the other and saying, the great thing about the internet is nobody knows you're a dog. And this is a problem in the digital world, right? Identity and authenticity is a huge problem in the decentralized digital world, and it manifests itself right in our daily lives. With if you just look at your internet traffic, there's something like 60 to 70% of internet traffic is now generated by bots, and 60 to 70% of that is fraudulent and malicious intent. We as humans are pretty good at dealing with that, but the machine world this is going to be a much bigger problem for machine-to-machine interaction and transactions and economic transactions. And the reason it's going to be a bigger problem is because machines probably aren't as good as people, at least not yet, at defending against the Nigerian prince who is offering you $1 million to arrange a simple cross-border transaction. we know he's not really a Nigerian prince. We know he's really after our bank account details. But machines aren't, and particularly the machines sort of at the edge that are low power, low sophistication sensors. And they need digital identities. They need immutable identities. They need absolute assurance of who they are in order to interact and transact at the edge.
In the future, will the digital VIN replace your traditional VIN that's found on vehicles around the world today?
The traditional VIN stamped on the physical vehicle will still be there. It will be linked to the digital identifier, and that digital identifier will be much richer than the VIN because it will act as a trust anchor back to all of the information that you know about the vehicle. For example, the first MOBI standard on vehicle identity was essentially a birth certificate, contained all the information you would know that would be relevant that is available when the vehicle is manufactured and leaves the factory. And it's sort of the difference between a birth certificate or a social security number and a human identity, right? When somebody wants to know who Grayson is or who Chris is, they don't want to see a copy of our birth certificate or our social security number, right? That's the equivalent of the physical VIN. What they really care about is, who is Grayson? Where does he live? Who does he know? What are his skills? What's his education? Where does he work? That kind of thing. So your identity is much richer, and having a trust anchor allows you to access that much richer set of data in a secure way in a digital economy.
Will that eliminate fraud where these stories come out all the time where on the secondary market somebody bought a lemon? So if this digital birth certificate says, okay, this car was flooded or got into an incident, whereas it's there in the digital birth certificate, so you actually know if you're buying a used car what the true history is, and somebody can't forge it or say, oh, don't worry about that smell. It's okay. The person just smoked cigarettes or something.
I always remember that Seinfeld episode of the car that smelled and had to be junked. But yeah, there is a huge market failure in the secondary market for vehicles. And George Akerlof, who was a professor of mine at Berkeley when I was there, wrote a paper called "The Market for Lemons" that several years later he won a Nobel Prize for. And it's an amazing paper because it deals with this very pervasive market failure when one side of an economic transaction, has more information than the other side, asymmetric information. When that happens, market prices tend to deviate from the full information market clearing price, and they settle lower. And the cost of that asymmetry of information is borne by sellers and buyers. But in the case of vehicle sales, it falls very heavily on auto manufacturers and the companies that have financed the cars, and dealers who are receiving lower prices, or sellers generally who are receiving lower prices than they otherwise would be entitled to. So anything that can improve the balance of information, the transparency, and reduce that asymmetry is a step towards market efficiency and a benefit to both sides. So that is a good thing. The second vehicle identity standard that MOBI is coming out with is related to everything that happens in a vehicle's life after it leaves the factory. For example, did it have its repair history done on time? Did it use the parts that were recommended by the manufacturer as opposed to counterfeit parts? Was it involved in a serious accident? All of these things affect the value. Buyers and sellers both should know, and if they do, the market clearing price will be more efficient.
Is this the power of blockchain? Because with the cryptography, it's tamper-proof, and once the incident's been on the ledger, somebody can't modify it. You can't slip somebody $100. Yeah, make that piece of paper go away. Is that the beauty of this? It enforces trust?
That is exactly right. It doesn't necessarily mean that the information is correct, right? If you register bad information, all you do is perpetuate that along the chain. But a lot of the problem with information is that you don't know the provenance, that the chain of custody is unclear, that there could be mistakes along the way. So what blockchain does is at least it makes it transparent, makes it immutable, and you can trace the chain of custody of data back to the original source and say, okay, I see who input that. I see who's responsible for that data on the chain, or I see that this vehicle is linked to this database at the manufacturer that tells me this. Okay, I can trust that data. And because I can see every step along the way, and nobody has privileged access to a root directory, nobody can change the data on the chain without being apparent to everybody else, then it ends up being much more trustworthy. Not right with a capital R, not truth with a capital T, but at least more trustable because it's immutable and transparent.
And we're seeing examples of that in the global supply chain is using a blockchain to keep records. We're seeing, in my opinion, really great strides in the art world, where art is being, because there's a lot of fraud in that world, where it's starting to eliminate that. And we're also seeing new markets open up. And during a February 2020 interview with FreightWaves, you stated the following: the convergence of AI, IoT, and distributed ledgers allows anything, whether it's a person or a package or a vehicle, to have a trusted ID and link that to other attributes. So for the first time, we can begin to export digital economics to physical things. If you can combine location with secure ID, that opens up enormous opportunities, a whole new economy. Vehicles now can pay as they go. What is this new economy? Is this the commerce we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, we got into it a little bit earlier, but let me just expand on it. So when you can link the secure ID to location, you can pay as you go. What would you want to pay for that can't be paid for easily today? The most obvious thing, I think, is roads themselves. There's $27 trillion or so of transportation infrastructure in the world. The vast majority of it is not tollable, right? There's only a small fraction where you can put, so the cameras and gantries and transponders and charge something approximating marginal cost for the road use. But there's that is expensive because it takes a lot of physical infrastructure, and not all that efficient to toll that way. But there's a new world coming where the vehicle telematics and combined with the vehicle ID can allow very, very cheap micro tolling that not only works on the roads that are tolled today, but will work in places like the urban canyons of cities, sort of block by block. And what this does is it opens up a whole new area for public finance, right? There's a huge problem with infrastructure finance today, right? Politicians always talk about the infrastructure deficit, how we'll need, X number of trillions of dollars just to put Band-Aids on the crumbling infrastructure that we have, much less fund any new infrastructure. And if you can charge marginal cost for roads, you have a way of replacing the gas tax, which is likely to go away as vehicles become more efficient and electrification takes hold. But you also have a way of charging the right people, the people who actually use the infrastructure, the cost rather than the wrong people. Your infrastructure finance today comes from sales taxes, from property taxes, from bond issuance, and often falls on the people who don't use the infrastructure and can least afford it. So there's a whole new opportunity here for public finance, but I would say that is only the start of it. You can also charge for things like congestion that can change behavior. You can do usage-based insurance in ways that incentivize drivers to drive safer because they're getting a lower insurance cost because their behavior is actually being monitored and good driving is rewarded. You can begin to charge for public bads like carbon or emissions, right? And differentially incentivize clean vehicles over dirty vehicles, and so on and so on and so on. There's just a whole lot here. We think this is a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. We've called it the new economy of movement, and I think that the next 10 years are going to see a real explosion of it.
When you're looking at, you mentioned micro tolling, I'm very curious, and to build out a tolling booth is very controversial and very expensive. To get around that, do you just build a digital map, like a 3D world that you, using geofence technology or something, when the vehicle goes into X urban canyon, it triggers the toll without having to build out all that physical infrastructure?
It's actually much finer grained than that. You don't need the congestion pricing schemes today, like London city center. Have gateways, and you pay when you go in. The problem, and there's cameras and things today that enforce that. The problem with that is it creates an incentive once you've paid not to get out. So if you are a mobility service provider, right? You go in and you stay in and you drive around within that area, because once you go out, you're going to have to pay again. And so they make the schemes more complicated, and they say, okay, well, if you go in twice, you get a discount the second time. The problem is the more complicated these schemes get, and New York's scheme, I think, had 10 or 12 tiers of different charges for different things, and where you've been, and how many times you've been in that day, whether you were handicapped. It just gets so complicated that you lose all ability to have any trust in the system. It just, when you've got a bill, it would just look arbitrary. The blockchain technology allows you to be much finer grained, allows for smart contracts to allocate costs in much more trusted ways, but it also allows for a much finer grained charging. You can actually, right, as long as you can tell, right, the path of the vehicle, you can charge by the foot, right? You can charge by the centimeter if you wanted to, once the location technology gets to that level. And it is getting to that level, right? You have GPS today that is fairly coarse, can tell a vehicle's location within a few meters on the open road, and maybe within a few tens of meters in a city canyon. But you start adding mid satellites, location satellites, low-level satellites of the kind that some car companies are launching already today. There's a Chinese car company that's launching 500 satellites to aid its GPS for these purposes. Elon Musk satellites, ground base stations, vehicle-to-vehicle triangulation. All of these things are going to help locate cars down to the centimeter rather than the meter. And at that point, you can charge for parking. You can charge for all of these other things really at a micro level.
You bring up a really valid point around markets when you talked about London and the incentive is not to leave. You eliminate the black market because you could have a bunch of Uber drivers that come in there, or black cab drivers, and they got to deal with a guy that's got a parking lot, and they pay him X% of the thing, and it never goes out, so they never pay the tax. And so you can call them tax dodgers or whatever you want, but you left a loophole, they exploited it. What you're explaining with this blockchain, there's no loopholes to exploit, similar to the one I just described?
I think that's at least the potential of it, yeah. If you have a trusted ID, if you have it coming directly from the telematics of the car, you can create the trusted trip. There's no more loopholes. You add that to a smart contract system where the proceeds, the tax, is allocated algorithmically so that everybody can see it, trust it. It wrings out a lot of the middleman authentication, audit, and allocation costs. You can get the transactions cost down from sort of the current, sort of cost of 20 cents or 25 cents a dollar for current tolling technology, even where it works, to fractions and fractions of pennies.
You're saving governments money. You're increasing their tax revenue. So why are they not banging on your door and knocking it over, saying, "Come on, Chris, bring the MOBI technology to our country"?
We are starting to see it. I think it's still very, very new, right? Not every car has the telematics to do it. No cars have onboard wallets. No, these wallets that people are talking about have to have some sort of standard ID. The MOBI ID is our proposal for that, but there are many others working on it, including many governments. And once you have it, I think this gets adopted very quickly, because the benefits, and when you think about, we talked about Facebook earlier. I think, Facebook, when they proposed Libra, every government in the world dumped on the idea the next day. For what we are talking about here, the governments, the public sector is the big beneficiary. And so I think that the adoption will come very quickly once the technology can be shown. And we have submitted a number of grant proposals for government grants. We're talking to a number of governments about piloting the early stage of the technology. We have beta versions of apps that link location and ID that can monetize road. They look just like a map-based app, only they're built on Hyperledger, which is a blockchain language, and using the blockchain technology to make it trusted, immutable, and to preserve the privacy of the actors in the system.
Privacy is key. So these vehicles will be able to pay for parking. They can do usage-based insurance. They can pay for infrastructure. Will they be limited in commerce if you're driving down the road and there's an augmented glass and then there's an ad? "Oh, hi, Chris, you searched for this today. Would you like to pull over and try their new donut or try their new sandwich?" Will the vehicle wallet and what type of transactions that can be done in the vehicle will there be any limits to it, or is it just going to be a complete free for all?
Yeah, so the privacy and access to eyeballs is a huge issue, right? For the last 20 years, the biggest companies in the world were created by scraping data, creating data silos that were proprietary, essentially creating data monopolists. The business model was accumulate data, use the data to create better algorithms, use those algorithms to create better consumer service offerings that better delight the customer, and use that to get more data in a virtuous cycle. And once that reaches a tipping point, that becomes an insurmountable barrier to entry. And so what you see is companies getting bigger and bigger, and these platforms being absolutely unassailable. But I think that that model is changing for a number of reasons. I think people in governments have become much more appreciative of the value of data and the value of eyeballs. The technology is coming along so that data can be what's called self-sovereign. You have control over it. You can choose to share it or sell it or monetize it if you own it in ways that you choose, and they give you property rights over it rather than the person who manages to scrape it first. So I think that's coming. I think building that into mobility applications that we've done is a huge advantage because it allows untrusted parties to work together, and in the confidence that they're not giving somebody else, a potential competitor, access to their customers or their business model. One of the things that everybody talks about in mobility is the multimodal trip. The idea that one app, one gateway, one identity, one payment mechanism can give access to a complete trip that might include scooters, walking, a car share, a train ride, and maybe a bus on the far end. Today, you don't see that happening, at least not very much, because competitors don't want to have their data in a place where it can be scraped by a potential competitor. So putting that on a chain, putting it in a more secure environment, limiting what data gets shared, building that in is, I think, extremely important, and is the future of these kinds of mobility apps.
That's a valid point. When you look at privacy, we can all thank Tim Cook and Apple because they're bringing privacy to the mainstream consumers that might have not been concerned about it before, or now very well concerned about it. And when you look at the data sharing side of the house, MOBI is doing a lot of really great work around it. And recently, Denso and GM released the Connected Mobility Data Marketplace Standards for mobility data sharing through MOBI. In the announcement, Roger Berg, the Vice President of North American Research and Development at Denso, stated the following: sharing data securely and through common standards can unlock a vast variety of positive mobility outcomes, from accident reduction to privacy protection to improving traffic flow. Extremely smart. Is this needed? Are common standards needed to enable secure, private, in-vehicle commerce?
Of course they are. Everything that humans do is done by standards. Language is a standard, right? How did God punish people, right, when they were bad in the Bible? Remember the Tower of Babel? He took away their ability to communicate. He took away their language. Money is a standard. Driving on the right side or the road or the left side of the road in different countries is a standard. It doesn't matter too much what the standards are, but you better have them, or you can't have any kind of coordination of human behavior. And the same is true in the machine economy. Standards for vehicles to identify themselves, their position, their direction, their speed, their intention will likely be needed for level 5 autonomy, because I think that the problem of standalone autonomy, the kind of autonomy that companies have been working on, for the 18 or so years since the DARPA Grand Challenge, is really, really hard. Sort of the mother of all AI problems. And it's kind of why I think that there's so much hype in this space, and it always seems to be 2 years away from arriving, and always will be. But coordinated autonomy, I'm much more optimistic about. I think once vehicles can share information in real time at the edge, and particularly share their intentions or what they see around corners, that allow sort of real-time local mapping, real-time ad hoc local networks for communicating, then you can get to the level 5 autonomy that because you've sort of put the autonomy on steroids and given it capabilities that standalone autonomy can never achieve.
There's no doubt that the edge is the That's the only way we're going to get to level 5 or even level 4. But what happens to the vid and the vehicle wallet when the vehicle is fully autonomous, operating on a shared network? And so you have Chris, you're in one vehicle, I'm in one vehicle, then we go to different vehicles. Does that wallet follow around us like a digital passport, or how does that work when you start having individuals in different vehicles on a shared network?
Yeah, so I think the one aspect of it is the coordinated autonomy. When you get to fully autonomous vehicles, then you can share intentions. The vehicles themselves can coordinate their behavior, and what you get is much more efficient traffic patterns because a vehicle can negotiate with another vehicle to slightly speed up or slightly slow down. Now, there's been some work done on this, some particularly interesting work by Carl Wunderlich at Nobilis. He's on one of his talks is on our website, and the idea that you can have vehicles coordinating their behavior. The early experiments, the early tests seem to suggest that you can get massive increases in the throughput for a given road footprint. Perhaps even like an order of magnitude. So that's huge. An order of magnitude increase in throughput in the city solves all of the congestion problems that you would have today without building any additional roads. So that's one aspect of it. The question about the digital passport that travels with consumers, whether the passport or the digital ID is something that goes with a person or something that goes with a car. It depends, I think, who or what owns the wallet, the person or the car. And I think that the way this will evolve is that there will be digital IDs for people, there will be digital IDs for companies, and there will be digital IDs for things. And all of those IDs will be used for transactions at the edge. The IDs for things will allow this economy of things, or this new economy of movement that we've been talking about, and will ultimately allow the vehicle to, as it gains in intelligence, as it gains in sort of its onboard AI capabilities, to increasingly become this autonomous economic agent. And you can even imagine a world where the vehicle is essentially a standalone company operating by itself, succeeding based on what it learns through its AI and its machine learning, making a living off of its environment by providing mobility services, which, if it learns well and earns money, its software would be replicated in another vehicle. Perhaps it buys another vehicle and one that's going bankrupt, i.e., its software isn't working, and installs its software and thereby replicates itself. So I think that this whole notion of autonomous organizations, is kind of far in the future in science fiction, but it's interesting to think about whether a vehicle could own itself.
It's very interesting to think about monetizing assets as the future. And you look at society and you look at culture, and it really hit me. There's a really great rapper from Miami, now based out of Atlanta, Rick Ross. And Rick Ross has been talking a lot about how he monetizes assets for coming to America too. Yeah, but at least out to Eddie Murphy, it paid my mortgage for a couple months. Like, there's all this, and it's becoming, you see a lot of trends start in hip hop culture that then eventually carry over into the mainstream. And I'm starting to see a lot in the hip hop culture about monetizing assets. And 3 years ago, you started MOBI. Did you start to see this trend before anybody? Was that the inspiration of monetizing assets, creating the standards platform to enable this new movement economy?
I think what got me excited about the space was the opportunity to monetize a whole new ecosystem. Having lived through the derivatives revolutions and the securitization revolutions in finance, I think I had a little bit more insight, perhaps, into how these revolutions can happen and the opportunities they can create. I think I was some of the experiments that we did at Toyota and Toyota Research, some of the POCs we did were some of the first experiments in applying the blockchain technology to things rather than just pure sort of fintech and finance applications. So I think we were early, but lots of other people were thinking about that IoT application as well at the time. And everybody was having the same experience that we were having at Toyota, which is it's fairly easy to put a thing on a chain. It's fairly easy to put a vehicle on a chain. But what do you do with it? It's really hard to take that and get it to a customer scale, enterprise scale application. It turned out that the technology wasn't the hard problem. Putting a vehicle on a chain wasn't the hard problem. Getting to scale was the hard problem. And to do that, you don't need a minimum viable product. You need a minimum viable community. And that was what motivated the launch of MOBI. Is we saw that none of us, even the companies as big as the GMs, Toyotas, and Renaults, and IBMs and others, the biggest companies in the world, weren't big enough to form the minimum viable community to do this. Blockchain is essentially a collaborative activity. It only works in business networks and in ecosystems and business ecosystems. And therefore, you have to get together with your competitors, with all of the stakeholders in the ecosystem, with all of the transactors in the ecosystem, and do it together. You need to start with standards. There's no shortcut. And you need to build on those standards, create a network of shared services, and then you can build your applications on top and begin to monetize. And that's kind of the roadmap for MOBI and what we're trying to do. And it's a multi-year project.
Is the MOBI community one of the main reasons why companies are choosing to develop standards with MOBI?
Absolutely. That's the driving reason, is the chance to come and do it together in a way that they can address this problem about to get to scale.
It's fascinating. And MOBI's doing great work, and you're going to change the future. You're going to allow commerce to happen in a secure, transparent way. And Chris, as we look to wrap up this extremely insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them?
Simple. I think there's a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity in the new economy of movement for connected cars and pay-as-you-go for infrastructure, for congestion, for pollution, for services, for insurance. The most important autonomy, autonomy is coming, but the most important autonomy, I think, is the payments, not the self-driving.
You're 100% right. It is commerce. The future is bright, the future is autonomous, and the future is the new economy of movement. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed in this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.